how has your understanding of we changed since the rise of the internet? Or how have your, if I could ask the other way around,
Sure.
how have your principles of economics changed your understanding of we?
Well, I'll answer both questions. You may remember it was the end of 2006, Time magazine came out with the Person of the Year, and it was you. And that was all about user-generated content, YouTube, and so on. Well, if they did a new cover, they should make it we, or us, because it's no longer about users generating content, it's about users collaborating. And more than that, about creating some kind of collective intelligence, whereby together we can, who knows, maybe even create some kind of consciousness that transcends individual human beings. And in MacroWikinomics, we talked about these 5 principles of collaboration, openness, sharing, interdependence, and integrity. And you can see these principles being brought to bear in all kinds of different institutions around a new communications medium. And the big one that's on all our minds right now is in the Mideast, where you have Tunisia and then Egypt and what's next. You have people now collaborating together in a massive way with enormous power, including the power to bring down a government.
You were just mentioning in your talk that in Egypt, Tunisia, there is no leader anymore who's actually leading this revolution.
Yeah.
You were talking about the wiki revolution. Where did all the leadership go?
Well, it is a wiki revolution. And it's like that video that I put on YouTube about the MacroWikinomics murmuration. I mean, starlings flying around in these huge, spectacular displays of aeronautics. They have leaders, but the leaders change constantly depending on the situation. And up until a year ago, there were no big upsurges that involved, that did not have great leaders or strong leadership. And up until 3 weeks ago, there were no actual revolutions where an old government was defeated, where there wasn't, a vanguard party, a Islamic militia, a Che Guevara type guerrilla group. These have all been hierarchies and organizations with an ideology, and they mobilized the masses, and they armed the masses, and they brought down an old government, and they were prepared to take power. Well, and it goes back to George Washington, to a lot earlier. Well, now with the web, we have these. What the web does and social media does is it radically drops the transaction and collaboration costs of dissent and of renewal. And that means that large numbers of people can come together as peers and do something extraordinary, including bringing down a government.
But what does this mean for leadership? I mean, one of the biggest problems we are facing in Tunisia, we probably will be facing in Egypt or Yemen or Syria, whoever is going to be next. There will be some kind of vacuum if there is no leader in the revolution. And if there is no opposition, how can we build this new kind of leadership?
Yeah, it's an extraordinary problem, because what happens is this new movement brings down the government, but there's no force to take over and become a new government. So there is this huge vacuum, and that vacuum can be filled by the old regime coming back in again. It can be filled by extremist elements like Islamicists who can come in and destroy secular society, democracy, and take us back centuries. So it's a quite astonishing problem, and it means that the West has a big responsibility to make sure that that there is the rule of law, to encourage the creation of some kind of interim government, to not have elections right away, because if you have elections right away, those that are organized can win the elections. To make sure that the murderers who killed people in the streets, that they're punished, and to encourage an orderly transition. Now, I understand that just today, President Obama, in fact, contacted Mubarak and said to him, look, you got to move along, and you got to do this in an orderly way, or really bad things can happen. Of course, Obama's right about that. It's a nice change for U.S. policy, rather than supporting these.
It would be a nice change, yeah. If you look at companies, this leadership in a networked society or within a networked company, how does it look like? Are we going to lose all kind of hierarchy, or will it be something in between, or what do you see?
That's a really interesting question. One of the new ministers in Davos of the Tunisian government that I talked to foresees that this horizontal revolution will lead to a much more horizontal government. That's the term that he used. Now, he didn't really explain what that means, but it's a pretty juicy proposition. You know, we talk about this in MacroWikinomics, government as a platform, government as a network, as opposed to an old industrial age bureaucracy.
But isn't a network something different than a platform?
Well, they're both. A platform is an instance of a network. We talk about network governments, whereby we network all kinds of capability in society to create public value. One of the ways a network government can do that is by creating a platform where others can self-organize. And you create a platform by just releasing raw data.
But this would actually mean, I think what we are seeing right now is the power is with the network. So actually it's nice to have a platform, but if the network doesn't care about the platform is actually useless.
I think you're using the term platform in a different way. I'm referring it to generally as governments provide data that enable individuals, civil society organizations, private companies, and other governments to create their own networks to do something, to solve a problem in society, to deliver a service, rather than governments doing this themselves as they have in the past.
Where would you say does collaboration and leadership meets?
The concept of leadership is changing fundamentally. You know what? The destruction of the Tunisian government was brought about by a new kind of leadership, collaborative, collective leadership. There was no great orator, no great visionary selling a vision down. There was no command and control executive who was responsible for orchestrating all this capability. It just kind of happened. And it happened almost overnight. And so we need a new kind of leader. Leaders who work together in networks, who understand that the interests of themselves is consistent with the interests of the whole. Now, we also need people who stand up and inspire and motivate. We need super smart people who provide leadership in a more traditional sense, but increasingly they'll lead through people, not over people.
How does in this concept fit terms like transparency, you were using it in your talk, and reputation?
Well, transparency is one of the principles of these new networked models of everything. And we need to build transparency into every institution, whether it's the financial system or models of government, democracy, or our models of science, or our models of education and the university and so on. And this is a good thing because sunlight is the best disinfectant. And also transparency drops transaction costs. So you get better innovation, you get lower costs, you get things happening more quickly when you bake transparency into the DNA of any entity.
What about reputation?
Well, individuals can have reputations, but now collectives can as well. I mean, the Tunisian youth have a reputation for having great courage and integrity and understanding interdependence and the power of collaboration.
So again, if we're looking on companies, if you empower with all these collaboration tools, if you empower your employees, how does this as to look like in an organizational structure? I mean, we are still looking at all these diagrams and
org charts and so on.
charts.
Well, hierarchies won't go away, not in my lifetime. But increasingly, things get done through networks, and networks that go beyond the boundaries of a corporation. So boundary decisions are very critical as a part of business strategy. And networks, for example, usually perform better than traditional vertically integrated corporations. That's why Cisco built a business web, won, and its competitors fell behind. It just had a better business model. The future is about networks, but there's a big transitional period, and hierarchies still perform certain functions. They're a good way of organizing work and labor and having certain accountabilities and responsibilities and so on. But increasingly, they're not going to be the modus operandi and the core architectural principle of an enterprise. The network is.
Your message in MacroWikinomics is actually that you can transfer those criteria you've written actually in Wikinomics to any kind of field we are living and working in.
Yeah.
Is it really the same if you run a company or if you run a university or when you run a nation?
Of course not, but the organizing principles are. And the reason is that this is not some interesting set of changes we're going through. I think that all of these institutions have an industrial age architecture and modus operandi. They've come out of the industrial age. And this is not some aftermath of an economic slump or some big weird social media revolution thing that's going on. This is a turning point in history where we need to rebuild all of these institutions. And of course, science is very different than the energy grid, but the organizing principles for the new model are the same. Collaboration, openness, sharing, intellectual property, interdependence, and integrity. And we have a new communications medium enabling us to rebuild these institutions.
What kind of effect do you think had the shutdown of the internet in Egypt? I mean, all what we...
Well, that was the end. When they did that, if anyone was not sympathetic with the young protesters, that made them sympathetic. Imagine, you're in a hospital, and all of a sudden you don't have the internet. You're a mother trying to find out if your kid is sick, and you don't have the internet. You're in love, and you want to communicate with your new lover, and you don't have the internet. I mean, and it was a statement of a lack of integrity by the government. Integrity is about being considerate of the interests of others. You know, it's about abiding by your commitments and about being open and about being honest. And Mubarak, when he shut down the internet, that was it. I mean, people just said, you know, this government is just not acting in my interests. It just doesn't have integrity.
Yeah. You actually...
Oh, by the way, as a strategy, highly unrecommended, okay, if you're some kind of dictator, because increasingly the internet is the foundation for commerce, for work, for learning, for healthcare, for social discourse, and you know, it's just not a viable thing to shut that down. It
was also very interesting to see when the moment they shut down the internet, Google and Twitter and some other say now or something like that, that you could really talk into your phone and it was tweeted.
Yeah.
So they were really kind of reinventing this thing very fast.
You know what? The world is developing a workaround for the actions of dictators.
So if you would have to imagine something like a world government, I mean, you're also arguing that the nation state and governments, you know, defined by nation state size, don't really...
Well, the nation state was a good idea, and it came out of this transition from feudal agrarian to industrial capitalist society. We had national economies, we created a border and a language and the rule of law and domestic markets and institutions of government and so on, national states for national economies. Except for this little problem today, increasingly we have a global economy. Yeah. So the EU already reflects this, you know. The EU is a state. It's not a nation state, but it's a state, a transnational state. And there won't be a global government in my lifetime again, but increasingly as these models of global cooperation based on nation states, the G20, the G8, the G2, or the UN, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, the GATT, whatever, increasingly these institutions are the wrong size for the global economy. So what we have now is these new multi-stakeholder networks that are emerging, and they're around the world solving problems, everything from poverty to fighting against climate change. And what happened in Tunisia and Egypt, it was not the result of some kind of a process, formal process. It was a process. You know, it created its own model of solving a problem. That problem being people don't want to be subjects, and they want to have reasonable lives. You know, young people graduate, they go into the workforce, there aren't jobs there. Investment bankers want to get their bonuses back up to the $50 million range. They say the recovery is here, but it's a jobless recovery. Well, that's an oxymoron, okay? Jobless recovery is a contradiction in terms.
So my last question would be, if you would have to name a couple of companies who are really performing well in this network kind of sense, which one would they be and why?
Well, of course, in both in Wikinomics and in MacroWikinomics, we talk about dozens of companies, and there tend to be good ones in every industry. I was just with an executive from Best Buy in the final night in Davos. His name is Cal Patel. And here's a company that, a terrible marketplace, consumer electronics during a huge economic recession. Their main competition went bankrupt. They survived, and they're doing well. And they're doing well because they're empowering young people, they're using networks dramatically, and they're changing their business model. I don't think they'll just be a retailer of consumer electronics. They're becoming a company that builds relationships with consumers where there's a deep exchange of all kinds of value. One of them being people buy stuff and they pay money.
Why is Apple still functioning then?
Well, Apple, people think it's a vertically integrated a traditional company. It's actually not. I mean, Apple does a lot of its design. That's its core competence. But the technical design is not done by Apple. I mean, if you look at the detailed technical design of a product like the iPod, it's done by a Taiwanese company in Shenzhen province called Foxconn.
And it's very closed as well, but still.
Yeah. I mean. Well, it's very closed, but then again, it isn't. I mean, why did the iPhone and the iPad take off?
Because the software was there.
Yeah. They opened up their platform, and the world self-organized on that platform. So Apple is not the real super closed juggernaut that you might think. Now, there are some issues around Apple. Why did they outsource their manufacturing to Foxconn? This is a company, 900,000 people, hiring 400,000 this year. Their factories are described as, they look like minimum security prisons. Huge suicide problem in these factories. People live essentially in a company town. Yeah, in Shenzhen province. So at a certain point, will consumers say, you know, even though I really like this iPad, I'm going to buy the one from RIM, because RIM doesn't outsource it to, Foxconn. So, and I just don't feel so good about Apple. That'll be interesting to see if that plays out.
Thanks a lot.
My pleasure, as usual.